carrots round my neck. Self-respect, when you out of line, you put yourself in check. They don't.
No automatic white balance? Only 2 ISOs? Man, I'm finna slap somebody at Sony. They know they shouldn't have made this. How can I can't shoot now with 2 ISOs? The Sony FX30 is not for beginners. I'll say it again. The Sony FX30 is not for beginners. Now, before I take offense, what do you mean by beginner? So a beginner is someone who has never owned a camera before. You're looking to buy your first camera, and the only thing you really shot on is maybe like a cell phone or a really old DSLR or something like that. That's what a beginner is, in my opinion. Well, if the camera is this good, why don't you recommend it to beginners? Well, because the Sony FX30 is a very complicated camera. Now, the Sony FX30 came out in September of 2022, and since then it's becoming very popular because every single YouTuber on the planet is talking about this camera, and for good reason, because it is one of the best Sony APS-C cameras out because it offers a lot of features. And one of those features is the 10-bit 422 ability that this camera has. Now, if you don't know what that is, in a nutshell, is basically more information in between your colors. What that means is if you have one color and you're transitioning to the next, it's gonna be a lot smoother because you have more information to work with. Now, if you haven't noticed that, then maybe this camera isn't for you. And YouTube does a lot with compression, so we won't get into all of that stuff. Now, a scenario that might be running through your mind if you're considering the Sony FX30 is something like this.
Well, I already have a Sony ZV E10 or an A6400, and this camera seems a lot better. I already have the lenses, so I might as well just go ahead and upgrade and get this camera, and everything is gonna be a lot better.
Unfortunately, that's not the case at all. This camera is very complex. There's nothing simple about it. Now, once you learn it, then you'll understand it. But if you have never dealt with a camera that shoots 10-bit, if you never dealt with shooting an S-Log and things like that, simply there's nothing simple about this camera. You see what I did there? I'm gonna give you some reasons why I think the Sony FX30 is not for beginners. Number one is the cost. Now, up front, you may say,
well, $1,800 is not a lot to spend for what you get out of this camera.
And you would be right. It is a great deal, not so fast, because there are some things that you will want to consider if you want to get the most out of this camera. The first thing is going to be an extra battery. If you're going to be shooting for any time on this camera and you want to get to know it, you're going to need at least 2 batteries at minimum, and that costs. The other thing you're going to need is a battery charger, and that costs. The other thing is if you want to get the best out of this camera, you're going to have to get an SD card, and that costs. Now, with the SD card, you really have only a few options if you want to utilize everything in this camera. Don't forget, you're also gonna need a card reader, and that cost. Okay, so these are just the basics to get the camera up and running and the cost. Now, if you wanna take advantage of the raw capabilities of this camera, well, the card and the things I just mentioned is not gonna be enough. You're gonna need an external recorder, and that costs. So something like the Atomos Ninja V or the Ninja V Plus costs this much. And then you have to look at the actual media or the SSDs that it uses, and this is that cost. Well, then you're gonna have to look at batteries for it. If you get the kit, then that's gonna cost you. If you don't get the kit, well, then you have to pay for the batteries, and that's gonna cost you too. So you see, things are starting to look a little bit different when we're talking about getting everything out of the Sony FX30, but that's just the beginning of it. The second reason I believe this camera is not for beginners is the learning curve on this camera. If you never picked up a camera before, and if this is your first time dealing with a camera, this is gonna be overload for you, like major overload, to the point where you probably will get rid of this camera within a week of you buying it because it literally can be that complicated. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, check this out. So if you want to get the best out of this camera, what this camera is made for is to shoot an S-Log3. S-Log3 is basically a color space that allows you to get as much information onto the sensor and out of the sensor as possible. And to do that requires some knowledge. Now, something you're going to want to use to get the most out of this camera and S-Log3 is going to be something called Cine EI, or Cine Exposure Index. Now, what Exposure Index does is it gives you a guideline on exposing your image. So this allows you to not clip your highlights and not crush your blacks. Now, if you don't know what that means, basically your camera can only have so much information at once on the bright end and on the dark end. That is called dynamic range. So this camera is supposed to have around 15 stops of dynamic range. So even with that amount of dynamic range, there's only so much you can fit in it at once. So what Cine EI does is it allows you to expose so you're not going over on one end or the other. Now, along with that, you can only shoot in 2 ISOs. Now, if you're familiar with ISOs, typically like on your A6400 or your Sony ZV E10, you can choose whatever ISO you want in order to get the picture the way you want it to. But with the Sony FX30, when you're shooting in S-Log3, you get 2 ISOs only. You get 800 and 2500. So no matter what you're shooting, those are the ISOs that you're going to use. So what does that mean? Well, that means if you take your camera into a room and you don't have enough light and it's too dark, even when you're at ISO 2500, well, then you have to add lights, which means you need to know how to light. Or the reverse, if you're in a situation to where you have too much light and you're shooting at ISO 800, well, you're gonna need something to cut that light down, like an ND filter. If you don't know what an ND filter is, that's basically like sunglasses for your lens. Now you're gonna have to learn how to use that ND filter as well. So again, that's a lot of information. So now that you have a full knowledge on exposing inside the camera and how to get the best picture out of it, now all you have to do is bring it into your computer and start to edit, right? Nope, it's not just editing. See, when you bring your footage into, let's say, DaVinci Resolve, it's not gonna look good. It's gonna look like this, flat. So now you have to change this picture into something like this. And it's not just with the click of a button. Now, if you don't know, there's things called LUTs or lookup tables. And basically what a lookup table does is it changes one color space to another color space. Now, it's not as simple as just taking a LUT and throwing it on, because it's a lot more complex than that, especially if you want to get good colors out of this. Now, when it comes to editing, you're going to want to use something like DaVinci Resolve because it's built for color. It is a free piece of software, but there is a paid version and you get more features with that, but I'm not going to get into that now. But just know that you're going to have to learn this software to a point that you can actually color grade and color correct your footage. And this isn't something you're gonna learn overnight shooting with the FX30, because you're gonna have to learn things like S-Log, Rec 709, color space transforms, nodes, and the list goes on and on and on and on and on. Now, if you're not a person who likes to dig in, you will have checked out long before this, because you will have gotten frustrated because you can't get a clean picture out of your camera. You're gonna be dealing with noise and all kinds of things, and you're gonna be asking questions in forums, and you're not gonna understand why this camera, if it's so much better, you're not getting the best out of it. I may have discouraged some people from wanting to get this camera, but that's not what I want to do. But what I do want to do is set your expectations so that if you do buy this camera, you're not thinking that all you have to do is throw a lens on it and you're going to get the best picture out of it because of what you see on YouTube. That's not the case. You have to put the time in with this camera to learn how to get the best out of it. Now, once you learn how to get the most out of your Sony FX30, then you can get some great footage out of it. And you'll be very pleased and almost amazed at what you can get out of this tiny camera here. Now, I'm still recommending cameras like the Sony ZV E10 and the Sony A6400 because they can help you in just about 80% of the things that you're going to want to shoot if you're a beginner. Once you get your bearings, I would say it's going to take you maybe at least a year or two to get the most out of those cameras before you hit the plateau, and it may take you longer than that. So what am I saying in a nutshell? Well, what I'm saying is this: whatever camera you choose, whether it's the Sony ZV E10, the A6400, or the FX30, you're gonna have to put work in. But with the FX30, you're gonna have to put considerably more work in. And the question you have to ask yourself is, are you ready? I'll holla at y'all, I'm out, peace.